Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the event on the Middle East post-October 7th, organized by the Greek Council of International Relations and Panteion University's Institute of International Relations. This is a very critical time and a critical moment, not only for the Middle East, but I dare say for the wider region. Following October 7th and the pogrom by Hamas against Israeli civilians and Israel's response, we are, I think, at a critical time. Israel has been fighting in Gaza and now in Lebanon against Hezbollah, but at the same time against the Houthis and all the Iranian proxies. And we are more than delighted and happy to have Dr. ARIEL LEVITE to talk to us about the Middle East post-October 7th. Let me briefly introduce Dr. LEVITE and then the two discussants, my colleagues, Professor Platias and Professor Roussos. Dr. LEVITE is a non-resident senior fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program and Technology and International Affairs Program at the Carnegie Endowment and the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. I want to say also that prior to joining the Carnegie Endowment in 2008, LEVITE was the Principal Deputy Director General for Policy at the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission from 2002 to 2007. He also served as the Deputy National Security Advisor for Defense Policy and was also a head of the Bureau of International Security and Arms Control, which is equivalent to an Assistant Secretary position in the Israeli Minister of Defense. He is also the author of many books and articles. And I want to welcome Dr. LEVITE. I want to thank him for his time. It's a very critical time. Everybody is waiting for Israel's response to the Iranian missile attack against the Israelis and Israel's sovereignty. And Dr. LEVITE, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Konstantin. Thank you all for the invitation. And to begin with, I do wish to apologize that I'm unable to do it in person for at least the Greek audience, but this time I can actually have put the blame on Greece because Aegean Airlines, like most other international airlines, had stopped flying to Israel for the time being because of the crisis. So I wasn't able to make it across, which I hope I can make up in person before long because I so much enjoy the intellectual interaction and the other attractions that Greece has to offer. So without further ado, let me talk for about 35 minutes because I do want to leave time for a lively question and answer. I want to try and address the topic that we have agreed upon through prism of four lenses. One national Israeli, one regional Middle Eastern, and one the global, and finally the generic, where I will be talking about what is happening in the Middle East but as symptomatic of either global trends or generic phenomena. So I will be talking about the Middle East, but suggesting that some things that we're observing are not unique to the Middle East or are not even unique to the global situation at the moment, but actually are more enduring. I am presenting slides just in order for the people to have a better ability to follow my argumentation, and then obviously happy to share the slides thereafter. So without further ado, let me talk about Israel. Israel was clearly caught completely off guard on October 7th. It was completely caught off guard from an intelligence point of view, which is an issue I'll get back to later. But it was also from a readiness point of view, completely unprepared for what was coming. This is perplexing given the level of investment in intelligence and readiness to deal with threats and so on. And I think it does lend itself to some interesting explanations, some of which are of particular relevance, I think, for the Greek audience, but we'll save those for later. But if I now talk about Israel specific, I think that the worst thing that was done to us as Israelis is that Israel was kind of dreaming of itself as being a villa in the jungle and believing that it could live in a sort of in a villa in the jungle, spent a modest amount on security, more than others. But if NATO now goes up to maybe 4% and so on of GNP, it won't be that much more, and otherwise could actually live in peace with a prosperous society, as well as kind of be not just secure, but also very urbane, global, and so on and so forth. And that perception has been shattered on October 7th and has been dealt by further blows since October 7th. So the level of vulnerability of the villa is now seen as perhaps the most worrisome aspect of what has happened in October 7th and since October 7th, with profound implications on societal aspects, economic aspects, political aspects, strategic aspects, not in the least deterrence and so on. So that's point one I wanted to make. The most remarkable aspect of what started as a localized conflict albeit of a quite a traumatic nature in Gaza, was how quickly it became a conflict that involved ultimately 7 fronts. And Israel is currently confronting 7 fronts simultaneously. So we have issues in Gaza with guerrilla warfare in Gaza. We have something approximating that on the West Bank. We have obviously an all-out war with Lebanon, even if we are physically present only in the southern edge of Lebanon. We have a confrontation with the Houthis in Yemen. We have Iranian militias and Iranian forces targeting us from Syria, from Iraq, and even directly from Iran. So imagine finding yourself simultaneously fighting. I'm not saying just confronting the political after effects of what happens on American campuses or Macron sanctions and so on. I'm saying actual fighting on 7 fronts. The third attribute that I think is important to note with respect to Israel is that makes October 7th seem somewhat surreal, is that against this very acute security situation that I described to you, we've been able to score unbelievable operational successes on all of these fronts. Operational successes in cyber, operational successes in intelligence, operational successes in kinetics and so on, and obviously in the process of dealing with fairly ferocious and brutal adversaries. What is even more important to emphasize here, because of the broad lessons, is that this has occurred against adversaries that have taken the cue from the Balkans and from other places and so on, and perfected the technique of building their capabilities above ground and underground in the midst of urban populations. And developing it to an unbelievable scale. And the difficulty of achieving operational successes in such a sort of, including deeply underground, on so many fronts, including ones that are 1,500 kilometers away from Israel, and doing it with relative precision. I'm saying relative precision because I think on the one hand, there is a significant degree of precision, but on the other hand, unavoidably there is collateral damage because you are targeting adversaries whose primary assets, whether it's money, ammunitions, leaders, and so on, are all in the midst of urban territories. So the operational successes have been intelligence, in targeting. Intelligence, I mean in penetrating deeply your adversaries, in being able to harness it with targeting capabilities, in being able to withstand daily barrages of missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, UAVs of different types, and so on a daily basis, including even this morning in where I live, which is in the center country, and so on. And being able to strike with precision as far as 2,000 kilometers away in Yemen, or a bit closer to that in Iran. So, but I underscore, these have been operational successes. These have not translated thus far into strategic success. And the reason they haven't translated into success is because the problem that Israel has been encountering on the one hand has been so profound and unique in the terms of the kind of challenges that it faces, that there is no appreciation for the difficulties we're facing in dealing with this kind of a situation on the one hand, but also because the Israeli leadership is struggling for political reasons, but also strategic reasons, to come out with a winning strategy to turn operational successes into a sustainable success strategically. And here we can go into details why that is the case in the Q&A. And in the meantime, the price tag is enormous. The Israeli population is truly traumatized. The number of casualties are mounting. We have a few casualties every day, military as well as civilians, and so on. We have over 100 hostages, dead and alive, still in Hamas captivity, in which we are unable to trade or retrieve. We're engaged in an acute military attrition that is unprecedented in Israeli history, because it's now been going on for a year on so many fronts, and involving anywhere from the home front to the battlefield, and the battlefield is actually everywhere, both geographically and physically and emotionally and so on. The economic toll is approaching $300+ billion already. We have been forced to evacuate large parts of the population, which is feeling now insecure in going back, and the ability to deliver them back to their territories, even if they were to the settlements, even they agreed to, hinges on providing them a level of security, which is very difficult to guarantee. Life is severely disrupted. I talked about the flights as just one symptom of that, and so on. There is a growing public fatigue, and obviously the external solidarity is wearing thin, even among steadfast Israeli allies, who either because of their own political domains or because of the collateral aspects of what Israel does, find it difficult to accept, and so on. And because it also challenges the international community to see UN forces like in Lebanon or in Gaza, US agencies providing cover and assistance to the extreme elements that have been fighting Israel. So I'm talking here about UNRWA on the one hand, and UNIFIL in Lebanon, and imagine the challenge it presents, and so on. And they're arguing that their mandate wasn't there, and that they couldn't resist pressures and things of that nature. So from a strategic point of view, two things I want to highlight. One on the bad side, one on the good side. On the good side, I want to say Israeli peace treaties with all the Arab parties, a number that has grown significantly in recent years, are holding. So Egypt and Jordan and the Sudan and Morocco and the UAE and Bahrain, all the peace treaties are in place and they're holding. Yes, there are pressures. Yes, there are tensions and so on, but they're holding. And in fact, there is a modicum of collaboration with them continuing throughout. One of the easier places for me to go to is Dubai and UAE at these times, because these guys, the ones who have actually kept flying, while all other international airlines have largely stopped. That's the bright side. On the downside, the onset of October 7th was largely prompted by a perception that the Israel constitutional crisis was creating a level of division within Israeli society that was creating a vulnerability of the nature that Hamas could exploit. And the sense now is that this seven-front war, although not the one that Hamas, on the scale that Hamas was hoping, they were hoping that all seven would actually attack Israel simultaneously, full scale, and so on. but nevertheless has created a situation where it is very difficult to dispel their perception that Israel is vulnerable in ways that it hasn't been before. And so one of the biggest challenges we're now facing is to remove this sense of vulnerability, which is not important just for deterrence purposes, but also for reassurance for Israelis living at home, for investors living sort of abroad, for tourists, and obviously the Jewish diaspora, and so on. So that is with respect to Israel. Middle East. What October 7th has revealed on a large scale, and I have a suspicion that we're going to go back to this in the Q&A, is how painstakingly Iran, and over so many years, Iran has built an excess of resistance, spanning the entire region, and taking advantage of the fact that the US was pivoting away from the region, not just by way of policy, but also in practice. And taking advantage of basically two major accomplishments. One is the nuclear, sort of achieving a nuclear threshold, namely the capacity to acquire nuclear weapons in 3 to 6 months solely on the basis of indigenous capabilities. And the second thing is the level of intense and intimate collaboration, now at the level of truly strategic partnership with the Russian Federation, an embryonic element of which pre-existed October 7th, but it is now full scale based on the Ukraine war. So that's, I think, the one most revealing aspect of what has happened prior to October 7th and has been revealed by October 7th. The level of the IRGC to coordinate this excess of resistance operating all the way from Iran through Sudan and Somalia, and then Yemen and Iran and Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and so on, including, as has been revealed in the last couple of weeks, extensive effort to try and get not just Hamas, but also Israeli Arabs and even some Jews to take part in this in triggering not just terrorism incidents, but also sort of assassination attempts at political leaders and others in Israel. And there have been mass arrests of people of that nature in recent weeks. Clearly, the Israel's operational successes have dealt a severe blow to the excess of resistance, but the fact that they're down the moment doesn't mean that they're out. They're bleeding. They have much greater difficulty of keeping them afloat at the moment, but their capacity to continue to harass and to rebuild, if, as they wish, they obtain a ceasefire, is absolutely there because there is nobody to stop them. The third issue is, we probably will get to this in the Q&A, is that the Iranian program is on the cusp of becoming an Iranian nuclear weapon. I don't think that the decision has been made as yet, but Iran has been very skillful in leveraging its status, not just for deterrence purposes, but also as a cover below which it could actually operate with in building the axis of resistance, basically threatening everyone that if you actually attack them and so on, they will cross the threshold. Enough to give everyone food for thought, particularly if you think that the problem then goes beyond just Iran and becomes also nuclearization of Turkey and Egypt and Saudi Arabia and so on. You can figure out who comes next. And that is only talking about the impact on the Middle East. The US has been able to prove that its anti-Iran coalition on the operational level that has been building through the Central Command has been largely effective, mostly in missile defense. However, it still is strategically feeble because the efforts to extend it politically and operationally have been hamstrung by both anxiety in the region and inhibitions in Washington. So the coalition has been very effective in missile defense, but when it came down to actually taking on the Houthis to eliminate the problem to global shipping, that is where the problem of this strategic feebleness surfaced, and the Houthis are not out. And because they have only been dealt with sporadically, locally, and so on. Egypt, from an economic point of view, is probably in the worst possible shape because the Suez Canal is de facto unable to operate with and generate most of the income. And at the same time, Egypt is so nervous about navigating its way through these troubled waters that it is unwilling to publicly participate in this coalition. This only shows you the strategic feebleness of that coalition. Jordan, that is already 70% Palestinian, is again showing increasing signs of anxiety, fearing that the war is going to spill over, the war and so on is going to spill over with turning Jordan into Palestine, just as the Egyptians are worried that the Gaza problem may become an Egyptian problem if, as a result of any form of arrangement that is being worked upon, the Gazans could become, could migrate in large numbers to Egypt. You are better experts in Turkey than I am, but I would say Turkey is meddling in regional affairs on an ever larger scale, directed from the very top. It has been a very important force of instability. And what is worse is if you listen to its president's statements, it has much greater potential to get far worse, namely to see Turkish forces directly or indirectly involved in some of the conflicts. Lebanon seems to be the prime potential, whereas previously it looked like it was Gaza. Namely militarization of the conflict with Turkish involvement. So it's not just economic sanctions on Israel and things of that nature, and hosting some of the leaders of the opposition and supporting them financially and otherwise, but it may actually become a far worse problem. And Qatar is a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's an important mediator and sometimes the only effective mediator, but also the one that is home to many of the radical elements. Finally, as an issue that is, I think, excuse me, I lost one of my, just a second. My head. So oil, which I know is a particular interest to you, is two things. For the moment, it's mostly a barometer of regional tensions, but it has a very significant potential to also become a target as such. And I'm talking here not just on oil fields, I'm talking about storage and supply. And my expectation is that if there is going to be round 2 or 3 of a retaliation between Israel and Iran after the initial attack, you're going to see oil increasingly become not just a barometer, but also a target. Okay, in the interest of time, let me race ahead and talk about the global and the generic aspects. If you look at the Middle East in and of itself, you may miss the point that the Middle East is only part of a sort of simultaneous flashpoints across the globe, and that there are multiple linkages between them. To draw on them, I think the example that is the most pertinent is Russia provides much of the link. Russia, with the war in Ukraine, which trying to divert attention of the West from Ukraine and the capacity to support it, on the one hand, is behind the Iranians and the support for the Iran. It's providing to Iran diplomatically, militarily, technically, economically, and otherwise, and so on. But this is not just the only example, and so on. So, but the point I wanted to emphasize in the first point is that the existence of simultaneous flashpoints across the globe makes it very difficult to deal with each of those. And if there are linkages between them, the problem becomes even more difficult. To give you another example, if someone now wanted to negotiate with Iran, historically the dilemma was, can you negotiate with Iran on the nuclear file as separate from human rights issues, as separate from its regional behavior? Now, can you actually negotiate with Iran on the nuclear file while leaving aside the Iranian assistance to the Russians in Ukraine? So politically and strategically, it becomes much more difficult because of those linkages. We'll get to China later, because China is similar and different in ways that I will mention in a few seconds. The second issue is that there are extreme pressures that you witness in most countries, particularly in the West, between domestic governance challenge, the bandwidth, the resources, and so on, and for the requirements for external and multinational security. You see this with the efforts that are being done now to scale up NATO defense expenditures, for example, and so on, at the same time that the economy is not in great shape in any of these countries. And there are other pressing issues, from climate change on the one hand to migration on the other. So the problem of focusing the minds on the external equation is extraordinarily difficult, even if you could agree on the prioritization of the threats that you have to deal with or the risks that you want to confront. The third issue, and I promised to weave in China as well, is that the Western-led global order is being acutely challenged. Now, that Russia is challenging is obvious. That China is challenging it, it's obvious. What is even less obvious, but no less important, is how broad swath of the world resists taking sides. Resist and are defiant in taking sides. So the question now is, will BRICS actually tilt all the way over the others, even Saudi Arabia, towards the anti-Western-led global order? But what is clear is that India and Turkey, to mention just two important countries, refuse to take sides, refuse to take part in sanctions, play both sides. They play Russia and they play the United States. And so there is something very important here, which is we're seeing this global order under such a severe threat. The Middle East reflects that, but the Middle East is merely a piece of the puzzle. You see that playing out in Africa on even larger scale, for example. A fourth issue, which I think is of a particular interest to the Greek audience, is the vulnerability of supply chains and sea lanes of communication. Why we have seen this as a particularly interesting phenomena, because the efforts to try and shift supply chains away from China and build them elsewhere are still not addressing the vulnerability that the sea lines of communications are now increasingly vulnerable, as is the case with the Houthis, as is the case with the Northern Route, and so on, with the Panama Canal being in jeopardy for other reasons, and so on. But I think that one had seen with the story of the attacks, the supply chain attacks through cyber, that it's not just the physical supply chains, but in the maritime or otherwise, it's also the cybernetic supply chains, which are showing high degree of vulnerability, and yet nobody can feel completely invulnerable. So you are dependent on cloud services, and the cloud services are all in the hands of a few, or you are depending on satellite communications, and Elon Musk decides that he doesn't like you. Non-state actors are proving to be an exceptionally thorny issue. It's not just external assistance, but it's something fundamentally is happening with commercial technology that is empowering them in ways that we never thought could be possible. The greatest harassment of Israel in recent weeks has actually been for the smallest, cheaper drones, just as in the case in Ukraine. They're too small to track, very difficult to shoot down, extremely expensive given to what it takes an F-35 to keep airborne for hours in order to shoot down a $1,000 drone. Amazing. And so this is only one dimension, which is the drones. Another dimension is the communication systems and so on. Look at 30,000 Houthis able to use ballistic missiles of ever sophisticated nature repeatedly against attacks that have a 2,000-kilometer range. 30,000 Houthis, where the country itself is sinking. So you understand that the non-state actors, the empowerment of the non-state actors, which is something the Russians have been taking full advantage of. I think we're going to hear from some of you some comments about the abundance of asymmetric warfare. So I won't go into great detail, but here is you see Israel building the most sophisticated, most war machine based on conventional capabilities and trying to fight symmetrically, whereas its adversaries are trying to fight it asymmetrically. And it presents an acute challenge, which is not well understood in the sense of having any appreciation for the challenge Israel is facing in dealing with this. The most intense, obviously, dimension of this is the confrontation between unmanned combat air vehicles on the one hand, and as well as missile defense and air power and missile defense and the ballistic missiles. What you're seeing here is, on the one hand, the most elaborate, sophisticated, multi-layered missile defense anywhere in the world. Remarkable in its accomplishment. Way, way, way better than in Ukraine. And it has made it possible for Israel to continue to live quasi-normally, even in the midst of a seven front war. We're going to the theater tonight, just to give you an example, which would have been inconceivable if we're unable to intercept most of these threats. But the cost of doing so, and the difficulty of doing so, and the technical challenge of doing so is quite remarkable. Finally, I've already alluded to the challenge inherent in dealing with these new security realities of kind of urban warfare, urban asymmetric warfare that puts in the center, hiding among population centers, under schools, within hospitals, within mosques, or under mosques, and so on and so forth, both in Lebanon and in Gaza. We've seen a bit of this in the Balkans. We've seen some of that happening in Russia, but we've seen this on the largest possible scale, both in Lebanon and so on. And the laws of armed conflict are struggling to cope with these new security realities. And the politicization and practice of lawfare is making this into a very, very challenging issue going forward. Because I think we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. Because if you can lose on the battlefield and win strategically because of this politicization, mobilization of the world against your adversary that will shackle its operational capabilities, you ultimately win. Okay, finally, a few generic observations to wrap up. I'm hitting the time I've set for myself. So one is, I've written an article which I assume you can find online in War in the Rocks, trying to explain the October 7th intelligence fiasco. The point I want to make here, we've seen on this incredible discrepancy between Israel's might in intelligence targeting and Israel's sort of miserable failure, once again, after 50 years, with trying to anticipate the Hamas attack and seeing what it is. There is a very long analysis that we should engage in to try and understand how this was possible. But I would argue that many of the causes of this problem are generic and largely irreconcilable. Part of it is politics. You were trying to warn your politicians that their policy they're pursuing is a policy of folly, and they simply don't want to hear. And they ask of you a much, much higher level of resolution and granularity of the warning than you're able to generate about the threats that are coming. It is very difficult to actually commit your forces, whatever they are, missile defense, internal security, military, the forward deployed units, and so on, to deal with every possible scenario, assuming there is no intelligence in place. So I would argue that these challenges are largely irreconcilable. They can diminish the probability or in the scale of disaster. They can't eliminate it ever. So one. The second point that I'm trying to allude to, a lot of people had fallen victim to the failure to distinguish between the quality of intelligence as intelligence for targeting and intelligence on intentions. And my point here is those are two very different metrics. Israel has clearly excelled in one and has struggled in the other I don't think that this is a unique case. I think this is a more fundamental and generic issue. The third, for both operational reasons and political reasons, and by political, I'm trying to say, how do you actually create symbols of victory? There has been a great attraction to opting for decapitation, knocking off Sinwar, knocking off Nasrallah, and so on. And we can talk, and this is not confined to Israel, of course. You had seen that with bin Laden, you have seen that with Soleimani, you've seen that in others. So on the one hand, the attraction of going in that direction, particularly if you can use your operational intelligence in such a way, and your targeting is relatively precise, is remarkable. You can't imagine the expression of gratification at the popular level, on the strategic level, from having accomplished those feats. And they've been remarkable. They've also had some operational benefits in instilling fear in your adversaries of how deeply penetrated they are. Because obviously the leaders are the best protected, and so on. And for those of you who have been watching it, there have been efforts to try and go after Bibi's home on the lane in the private home over the weekend with some success, but he wasn't there. So the lure of decapitation is incredible. The point to appreciate, however, is the limitations and the disadvantages. And the experience with decapitation is that often you're creating fragmentation of the adversary that becomes that then instead it's think of the sorcerer's apprentice example. You try to deal with one, you create many, and each of them becomes much more violent, difficult to coordinate, nobody that can actually create governance and so on. So there is an inherent tension here, whether decapitation is a good thing or a bad thing, because you're using at the end of the day very different criteria for assessing its benefits. Now, we don't really have the time to go into the laws of motion of societal warfare, namely when the militaries finally have to operate not only in the midst of societies in urban areas, but also trying to put pressure on these societies to turn on against their leaders, which has been something that has been tried in the Balkans, which has been something that has been tried elsewhere. Historically, Professor Platias can talk to you about those. But in essence, we've seen an abundance of that happening in Gaza. In Lebanon, the Israeli Prime Minister is explicitly calling in recent weeks for the population of those countries and those areas like Gaza to rise against their leaders. The problem is that what started as a kinetic war against Hezbollah's fighting force, and it started as a kinetic war against Hamas fighting capability and so on, now becomes one that pits the Israeli military to apply pressure on those societies to kick out the people that have been basically subduing them. And to do it by providing food aid and so on, or denying food aid, by moving them from one place to the other and so on. And the point is that over time, this is largely an inevitable process. The war lasts. The more you're getting inured from a kinetic war, you're evolving into societal warfare. Last 3 points. One is, one would have thought, naively, that the Iranians, assuming of what Israel is in the nuclear realm, would have shied away from attacking it. They haven't. But so have been the Egyptians, the Syrians in the Yom Kippur War in 73. So clearly we have to understand, and Saddam in attacking Israel with missiles in the 90s. So we clearly have to understand that those parties have drawn the line between what they thought nuclear could or should cover and what it would not. And so we are seeing here both, I think, a display that is not unique to the Middle East, but now is particularly evident in the Middle East, of both the strength and the limitations of nuclear deterrence. Finally, we are one of the major problems on October 7th with dealing with Hamas was that Israel assumed that it would be fully on behalf of Hamas, on the part of Hamas, to take on Israel, given how strategically superior Israel was. And it was operating on the basis that Hamas must be deterred. And that folly behind this assumption is that because Hamas was single-minded of how do they offset their strategic superiority by operational ingenuity, with a single narrow focus, they were able to cause Israel a major harm simply because for years they prepared for only one scenario and so on, in which they excelled in their capabilities. And I'm talking about scenario not only of the attack on October 7th, but preparing to deal with the Israeli onslaught that would follow by preparing for both above ground and underground, but also mobilizing the other parties and so on. And the final thing is kinetics and military operations in general are one component of a broad security strategy that inevitably has to deal with diplomacy and information and economics, whereas the military is only one component of this. What we have seen Israel excel in is in the military component of it since October 7th, not on October 7th. We have seen Israel struggling since, and because it has been much weaker for political and other reasons in working on the other dimensions of strategy. Let me stop here. Thank you.
This is excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Levite. And I think it has given us a lot of food for thought. Before passing the torch to my two great colleagues, Athanasios Platias and Sotiris Roussos, let me ask you a question, if I may. Your approach is largely inductive, starting from the national and moving to the regional and then to the global and eventually to the generic. Let me reverse the logic and start from the global and going all the way down to the national level. And trying to press the issue that I think is the gist of your presentation. If we accept the premise, and I do accept the premise, that the hegemonic power of the West does not enjoy its days of primacy anymore, and it's being challenged by a quartet of powers, of revisionist powers, Russia, China, that cooperate with lesser powers on many levels, Iran, North Korea, and as you mentioned, some of the BRICS playing the evasive neutral, like Turkey, for example. If we do accept your second premise that Iran has built an axis of resistance, if we accept the third premise that we've witnessed an evolution in the osmosis of technology with asymmetrical warfare, then my question is the following. Despite all these dazzling tactical successes that Israel has enjoyed in the battlefield, for how long can it sustain its defense despite the national cost that it has been absorbing in terms of losses, in terms of distraction, disruption of everyday life, in terms of the public images and the shift of international public opinion, as you mentioned, in campuses and so on and so forth, the strains between Israel and the United States. For how long can Israel withhold these losses, this pressure? And for how long do you think that all these peace treaties will hold if this pressure mounts at all levels that you describe, regional, global, national, and so on and so forth? And what is an alternative strategy, after all, if there exists one?
So I would give you, you're asking an extraordinary important and pertinent question, and one that doesn't lend itself to a short answer, let alone an immediate one. But I'll try to answer it in two different ways. One is to say, look, Israel at the moment is trying to maximize its internal strength against these and so on. It has made it possible to sustain a war for a year, which nobody seemed confident that it could. It has made it possible to fight on 7 fronts. It has made it possible to create a serious dent in the coalition that has been built against it. Okay? Precisely because that coalition enjoys all of those things that you talked about, the asymmetry, the confluence, and so on. It has come at an incredible cost. Okay? And so one big question is, will Israel be able to either compartmentalize the problems? For example, the Secretary of State is here today to say, let's create a ceasefire in Lebanon and then work on the ceasefire in Gaza and whatever and so on. Okay. Can we compartmentalize the problem? So we can actually focus on what we have to, and in the meantime, try to regenerate political strength and so on. I don't know the answer, but I think it goes in the direction that you've been talking about. Can we compartmentalize the problem of the Iranian nuclear program? If you look at my recent publication, and there is one more coming up in the last 2 weeks, and there is one more coming up shortly, you would see that what we're trying to say is there is a way of compartmentalizing the Iranian nuclear issue. It's not guaranteed to succeed, but there is a way of doing it. If Iran is both hurting because its coalition of proxies is weakened and its nuclear program is shackled, 2/3 of the problem goes away. Okay? So that's one question. Can we compartmentalize the problem? The second one is, that is a question that not only Israel is facing, but essentially every one of the NATO countries, perhaps with the exception of Hungary, okay, and Turkey. The question is, would the US remain as heavily interested in international security generally, and in Europe and the Middle East in particular, under Trump presidency, for sure, but perhaps even under Harris presidency, that would have to turn its attention inwards in order to satisfy the promises that it has delivered and to address the internal divisions that are surfacing with the United States. If the US, for reasons that have nothing to do with Israel and some to do with Israel, turns its back on Ukraine, on the Middle East problems and so on, and decides it's only going to confront China, or as Trump is saying, we'll move the troops back home, we're in a much, much worse situation. So that's a second part of the answer that I'm inclined to give you, which is a lot depends on where the United States is going to end up. The third, and that would be my last point, is, look, it's becoming clear that we need levels of cooperation. Nobody can be autarkic in this situation. Can we have whatever, sort of a level of cooperation in weapons production and supply? One of the things that you mentioned on the level of asymmetry, the most remarkable difference is in the pace of innovation. The pace of innovation among the proxies is breathtaking in terms of how quickly they perfect. The drones that hit Netanyahu's home was a perfection, not of the drones, because they were simple, but the operating technique of deploying several of them alongside all kinds of other capabilities, which made it very difficult for Israel to single out a focus on them, and so on. They have been literally innovating day to day. For large conventional militaries, innovation, that pace of innovation, and the ability to deploy resource in this is inherently limited. If we can cooperate, Greece is also a small country. Can Greece do all of this by itself? The answer is obviously no. So we clearly need to be able to cooperate and specialize and rely on each other. But rely on each other also means that if Greece now has some kind of tension with Turkey, the Germans won't say we're taking sides, we're not supplying weapons to anybody, or the French, for that matter, or the Brits, because they're saying that you're both NATO and they don't want to take sides. So the question you have to ask yourself is not only can you cooperate, can you dependently cooperate? So it's not just the economics and this, it's also, will they be there when you need them? And that's my third answer to you. And I haven't fully exhausted the answer. We should do it offline, Konstantin, but thank you.
Thank you so much. With no further ado, I'll relinquish the floor to Athanasios Platias and then to Sotiris.
Well, due to the interest of time, I will be very short. Eli, that was the best lecture that I ever heard on the strategic and the geopolitical elements of the Middle Eastern conflict. So we have a Saturn belt area there, that there is competition at three levels. There is at the level of great powers, United States, Russia, China have interest there. There are four local powers competing, two former empires, Iran and Turkey, that try to resurrect the Ottoman Empire and has occupied in Syria an area bigger than Lebanon, a Sunni coalition, and Israel. And then you have a lot of sub-state groups, non-state actors, operating at the same level. So the area is bound to create instability. But the question is the timing. Why Hamas started at that particular time? What was the theory of victory of Hamas? Was it to derail your rapprochement with Saudi Arabia and the Abraham Accords? Was it to derail the new routes from India from Middle East to Europe that were competing with the Silk Roads? Do you have any idea about the theory of victory of Hamas? Now, let me come to the theory of victory of Israel. I'm not sure from your analysis that I understood what's the strategic purpose of what the Israelis are doing. You said they are excelling at the level of the battlefield, but they don't have a strategic vision. Let me try to disagree with you, the way that I see it. First of all, your prime minister, that a year ago had a lot of domestic problem, now is more or less a hero and will probably have a snap election in the next 3-4 months, and he will be re-elected for 4 years. So politically, he proves a political genius. It also is changing the domestic balance of power within Israel from the centrist liberal coalition to his coalition. And maybe actually with his actions, maybe he's influenced US election in favor of Trump. So at the political level, I see a lot of political strategy. Now, at the strategic level, when it comes to Israel, you mentioned several fronts correctly, but in all several fronts, Israel is winning, is essentially weakening its opponents. And most importantly, Iran. At the regional level, Israel is more or less shaping a new order, which theoretically can produce more security. And it's weakening Iran, maybe at the level that we may have regime change. So I think these kind of military successes can be translated into a strategic victory. And geopolitically, how you can explain all this support that the United States is giving to Israel? I mean, some of our colleagues, like our former colleague from Cornell, John Mearsheimer, it says the Israeli lobby, but it may be geopolitics. It may be that it's a clear case that the West, by using Israel, is weakening one part of the Eurasian coalition. Therefore, what is happening there, it has global implications, especially if we take into account that the West is on the losing side on the Ukrainian front. So do you agree with this analysis, or I put too much coherence on the Israeli strategy? And by the way, do you see that what's going on in Ukraine and in the Middle East, in South China Sea, all this is coordinated? You talk about compounding threats. Are these all three threats coming together and are well coordinated?
That was brief, Athanasios. So here are a couple of things. First of all, I think some people will take issue with you on who are great powers of imperial background and so on. So I think your classification is going to raise some objections somewhere of people not feeling that you've included them in the list. But I will put this as theory, put it aside. You've raised a lot of great points. So I'll try to be very brief because I do want to try and leave some room for Sotiris to come in. Theory of the victory of Hamas. Hamas, as best as we understand it, and now we really think that we do because we have had access to their innermost documents. Not all have come out, but quite a few of them have come out. Assume that this internal, the combination of the axis of resistance that Iran was able to build, and on the one hand, domestic developments within Israel, were creating a moment of opportunity. So its long-term vision of ultimately creating this fight against Israel and so on was predicated on the one hand on Israeli vulnerability, a moment of extreme vulnerability, and on the other hand, on the presumption that the others would find it irresistible seeing Israel bleeding, go for the kill. And their planning was that even if it doesn't happen on October 7th, it will happen after October 7th. Namely, they would come in. Hezbollah indeed came in within 3 days, but they were hoping that the others would come in and that the combination of the military and other violent forms of pressure these guys exert on Israel, coupled with the reactions in the West to Israel's war conduct, will help finish off Israel. So I want to so that's the theory of victory of Hamas. Hamas was, okay, so 100,000 Gazans, 200,000 Gazans are killed in the process. He loses his family. The Gaza Strip is devastated and so on. But the victory itself would be accomplished by finishing off Israel. And that was the attraction of this excess of resistance that Iran has actually built. So that's point one. Is Israel actually winning against this? Well, as I said, it's a matter of time to determine. I think the problem we have is we have sustained the year. Can we sustain several years like that? No, we can't sustain several years. Which goes back to the question, the answer I gave Konstantinos. The answer is, can we now try and create a stable situation in Gaza while we focus on Lebanon? Create a stable situation in Lebanon while we focus on Iran. Take Iran out of the equation and deal with the others. Prevent Iran from being able to throw its weight behind those proxies and so on and so forth, while we rebuild, re-energize, restore the faith of the population in a ability to provide security and so on. It's a bit ambitious, maybe more than a bit ambitious, for Israel to take upon itself to be the forefront of the fight against this axis of resistance plus the geopolitical competition, when the US actually may not be willing to sustain its level of support. So that's, I think, is an issue of sustainability, and you know the issue of sustainability very well. How often did Athens was able to manage to get operational successes, and then at the end of the day lose the war? So sustainability, my friend, sustainability on the political, economic, diplomatic, and military is, I think, the name of the game. You had the sea, we have the US. Can we depend on this? Not 100% sure for the long term. Now, the US support. On the US support, I would say the following. Clearly, there is some sympathy. Okay, some sympathy. Clearly, there is some domestic affinity with the democracy and the Jewishness and all of those things and so on. Clearly, there is some sense that Israel is doing the job that the US is not doing and so on. But what worries me is that all of those are running against a much bigger problem in the United States, which is fatigue from foreign entanglement. You see this, for example, in conscription levels into the armed services. All of the services are struggling to keep their enrollment levels up. People do not want extended commitments abroad, particularly if those actually involve now very risky worlds. A strong pressure to say, let's prioritize. If we actually have to be abroad, China is the biggest threat, and so on. If we have to figure out where the biggest threat comes, it's commercial, AI, whatever, and so on, and supply chain rather than military and so on. I don't think that I think Mearsheimer is obsessed with the Israeli lobby, and I don't think the Israeli lobby is such an important element of this at all. But it's true that the issue is playing out in the US presidential politics, albeit now in a more complicated way than it has historically done. Because what happens is both candidates are playing the issue, but Kamala Harris is clearly trying to, on the one hand, not to lose the Jewish vote, while at the same time not to lose the Arab vote. And it's proving a much trickier game to play than it has been, because it's a much more the Arab, the Muslim vote, and so on. So it's no. But now let me, in order to leave some time for Sotiris, let me just say one last thing about the winning, the political ingenuity of our prime minister. It goes without saying that he's political Midas. I mean, truly. And his longevity in power and so on is a testimony to that. The public opinion polls that you have alluded to are not suggesting that he's been able to turn the tide in the way that you have described. In fact, most of the people believe that he should take the blame for October 7th and he should be replaced and so on and so forth. That being said, he is a political Midas, and if he calls new elections and plays around the successes while hiding the costs and not laying out a strategy to try and attain it, because the strategy would be strategy that would be inimical to his traditional commitments, he might be able to win in the next elections. But now to the winning strategy here. The most important element of a winning strategy for Bibi Netanyahu is to try and take Iran out of the equation. At the same time, he doesn't believe in a political settlement with Iran. The most important element of dealing with the winning strategy for everyone else in the world is dealing with the Palestinian issue. Bibi says, forget about the Palestinian issue. Let's Jordan become Palestine, de facto, whatever, and so on. We'll deal with Iran. Can this tension, where you don't want to solve the Palestinian issue and therefore you created this linkage that is so such a cement between Gaza and Lebanon and the West Bank and Jordan and the other sort of elements around the world and so on, that's the vexing issue that we're dealing with. So in my judgment, the big question we're facing in terms of the ability to develop a long-term winning strategy, as distinguished from a short-term winning strategy, is not only can you compartmentalize the problems, but at the end of the day, finding some way of making some headway on the Palestinian issue that would enable the other fronts to be separated. And that's a tall order, not just because of not only because, for Netanyahu, I think this is an impossible ideologically, politically, and strategically.
Thank you. Sotiri, go ahead.
Yes, Dr. LEVITE has already answered my second point, which was about the Palestinian issue, which was actually thought to be a dead issue or a frozen conflict or a dead conflict has been solved. But Hamas attack reminds us all, and Israel as well, that it's not the case. And it also can trigger all this instability and the conflict in the region. But I would like to make two other points that I would like to have his comments. We got the impression, not now from the reaction to the Hamas attack, that there are two Israels. One, I would say, some say there is the Israel of Israel and the Israel of Judea. Let's say that it is something that has been revealed with the division over the Supreme Court legislature, over the Jewish character of the state, and also on the issue of the hostages. Do you think that there's a very clear division and a very inconcilable division between the two Israels? Is there any division such? Do you think that there is such a division in the country? And do you think that this has repercussions on the ability to create a strategy, a sustainable, viable strategy in the region, this division? And my second question was that on the, let's say, on kind of predicting the conflict with Iran. You said that Netanyahu has focused on his strategy on Iran. And do you think that this means some kind of regime change strategy? And what do you think will be the reaction or the results for the region if we have an attack on the nuclear installations of Iran by Israel?
All right. In the interest of time, my answers to you, Sotiris, will be complete, but not satisfactory, because I won't have the time to go to the depth that the importance of the questions you raise merit. So apologies. Look, we've all along been agonizing where Judaism is a religion, a nation, a culture, all of the above or not, and so on. This long, or a territory. And that is long, a country, right? It's a problem that has all along haunted us, and it still does. We won't be able to resolve that issue now. And the tensions between definition of this identity as one or more of those has profound implications, particularly if you bear in mind that Israel has 25%, almost 25% Arab population, to give you just one example. So who are we? This identity crisis, I think, preceded October 7th, has largely disappeared since October 7th, is reemerging now with new twists, and it's disappeared because after October 7th, Israeli society says it doesn't matter if you're Orthodox, secular, or somewhere in between, whatever, and so on. You should support the government, you support the war effort, you support the military. And there was the incredible degree of societal mobilization that says we're one nation, okay? So for quite a while, this has disappeared from the agenda. It is reemerging now, and it's reemerging with a new twist, okay? Who is the government looking after politically, on the one hand? On the one hand, they've developed, cultivating the impression of a one nation, and on the other hand, only looking after certain sectors or segments of the society. It's another one because the ultra-Orthodox saying, we don't want to serve in the military. And the military is desperate, with so many casualties, both dead, wounded, and that level of attrition over a year, they're desperate for more people. I can tell you about the amount of reserve duty my son and my son-in-law are doing now, which is beyond belief. So the problem is reemerging now with all its ferocity, and as the moment is not reconciled. There is on the one hand the level of solidarity, which is still there, but on the other hand, the tension is building. And the tension is building, and will be a great challenge with what will affect what the next Israeli government would look like in terms of whether they try to work on the unifying forces or for political reasons, do as they have done over the past 2 years to become much more sectorial, segmented in terms of its approach. Okay, everyone who's elected is appealing to everybody, but then the next day they start sort of enacting policies. And the policies of this latest Netanyahu government, very much, by the way, in contrast to his previous ones, has been looking after very specific communities at the expense of others. So the issue is the divisions are there, they're very real, they're going to be important in shaping our future and so on. We've been able to bridge the differences, but not reconcile the differences. How will that play out in the long term requires a much longer discussion. And part of it is also what kind of a bridge do you build with the Israeli Arab population? In the previous government, actually had Arabs in the coalition for the first time. This one actually is trying to ostracize them. Will they be part of the next one? I don't know, but they're clearly a very important factor, and so on, including in how many of them would actually vote in the next election. Now, the issue of conflict with Iran, and let me wrap up there as sort of our discussion. The Iranian greatest anxiety is not as such about the attack of the nuclear facilities. It's not about the attack of the oil fields as such. It's not any attack on the RRGC. It's on the internal problems of the regime. The regime is very, very unpopular in Iran, and it's been using very crude repression to stay in power. The greatest fear of the Iranians has been that under it was kind of a Bay of Pigs scenario, namely that under the umbrella of a military attack against the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij and so on, there will be a public uprising. That this would be the moment of opportunity that the opposition forces were waiting for to actually get rid of the Islamic Republic. Obviously, this is a scenario which has been useful for deterrence purposes to scare the Iranians out of being even more offensive. This is something that is uppermost in their minds and how they actually deal with retaliation for an Israeli attack when it comes. Whether there is a viable strategy for turning through military action Iran from an Islamic Republic to something else, I'm quite doubtful, because I can't gauge the level of coherence within the Iranian opposition to the extent that one existed. So I don't know the answer for that. I would conclude by saying the following. I have no doubt that Israel, acting alone, certainly together with the United States, can inflict a certain amount of damage on the Iran nuclear program, much as I don't anticipate the nuclear targets as such to be on the list of the initial attack on Iran, the initial retaliation of Iran now. That being said, with the level of investment that the Iranians have made in making their program robust and resilient, it's the long-term ability to cap the Iranian program that I think is the biggest challenge. And that could not be accomplished by a single military operation. So let me stop here.
Thank you.
Thank you for your great questions.
Thank you very much for this very educated discussion and for taking time to address our audience here in Athens, the audience of the Council of Foreign Relations and the Institute of International Relations of Panteion University. I want to thank my two colleagues very much for their questions and comments, Professor Athanasios Platias and Professor Sotiris Roussos. And we do hope to see you in Athens under better circumstances.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Καλησπέρα.
Καλησπέρα.